everyone. My name is Jinhua. I'm an MBA student, class of 23. And on behalf of the Student Leadership and Ethics Board of the Sanford C. Bernstein and Company Center for Leadership and Ethics Center, I am honored to welcome you to Columbia Business School panel discussion on addressing affordable housing and housing insecurity, reporting with fellow board member Tom Goldenberg as part of the Leadership and Ethics Week. Leadership and Ethics Week is an annual event hosted by the Student Leadership and Ethics Board, which is the student voice on ethical leadership activities at CBS. Our purpose is to foster a culture and safeguard a tradition of principled leadership throughout the Columbia Business School community. The board fulfills this purpose by developing, implementing, and monitoring programs such as this, which cultivates leadership, builds a character, and promotes ethical executive decision-making. Leadership and Ethics Week is one of our signature programs, and we hope it helps current CBS students to become productive, moral, and importantly, caring future business leaders. Now to introduce our guest panelists. Today, it is my great privilege to be joined virtually with you all and our amazing panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Jill Kaduri. Dr. Khadduri is a principal associate at Abt Associates, a research company solving tough challenges in health, social, environmental, and international policy and development. Prior to Abt Associates, she worked at U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development over 16 years. Dr. Khadduri also has BA from Smith College and PhD in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins University. Our next panelist is Jennie Nevin. Ms. Nevin is an associate partner at McKinsey. Prior to McKinsey, she worked on economic development and public infrastructure at Prince George's County in Maryland. Ms. Nevin has a BA from Yale University and MBA from Harvard Business School. Our next panelist is our very own Professor Brandan O'Flaherty. He's a professor of economics in Department of Economics, Arts, and Sciences. Dan has PhD from Harvard University in studies of urban economics in relation to homelessness and crime. He has been teaching at Columbia for over 30 years and previously served as aide to Kenneth Gibson, Newark's first African-American mayor. Our next panelist is Dr. Jonathan Mossell. Dr. Woetzel is a director and senior partner at McKinsey Global Institute. He's been with McKinsey over 37 years. Dr. Woetzel has both bachelor's degree and PhD in political science and government from the University of Southern California. And finally, today's panel session will be moderated by our own Student Leadership and Ethics Board member, Tom Goldenberg. Tom is an engagement manager at McKinsey. Prior to McKinsey, he worked as consultant at BCG and has been part of various startups. Tom has BA from Sunny Empire State College and will be completing his MBA from CBS this May. Now I'll pass it over to Tom.
Thank you, Jinhua. And yes, very excited to graduate in a month. And this is quite an amazing panel. So I also want to thank all the panelists for being able to join us here. We look forward to an engaging discussion. And I would say to all the attendees, thank you for joining us. And please submit questions throughout the discussion in the Q&A. We will reserve some time at the kind of the end of the session for the panelists to address some of the questions. I can't promise that we'll get to all of them, but we'll try our best. So with that said, I think two things that would be good to discuss. Before jumping ahead to kind of what can be done about this situation of housing insecurity, about homelessness, about affordable housing, I think it would be good to get perspectives. And we have a really great diversity of perspectives here on what are the drivers of some of the, I would say, the crises that we're seeing in homelessness and affordable housing in the US in particular, but also kind of differences globally. I know, Jonathan, you're joining us all the way from, I believe, is it Shanghai? Is that right?
That's right. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think we can get, you know, understand kind of some global differences, but particularly in the US, what are we seeing? What are the drivers of that? I think cities have seen a rise in homelessness and lack of affordable housing. Part of that has to do with how our public policy plays out at a federal and city level, given that housing is not it's not an entitlement for our federal policy, but also in private markets and in real estate market, there are some dynamics there as well. Would love to get perspectives on. So I'll kick it off with that as a topic. Would love to get perspectives on what is the issue of affordable housing and homelessness in the United States, and what do you think is driving it? So I will open up whoever would like to take the first pass on that.
Well, I'll go first if you'd like me to.
Sure.
Basically, and I'll talk about in the US why we have so much homelessness. I mean, homelessness is the most extreme form of housing insecurity, but housing insecurity manifests itself in other ways, notably very high rent burdens, people paying 50, 60, and even 70% of their incomes for rent. And it also manifests itself in frequent moving and in doubling up with family, not by choice, but because people can't find another place to go. So we have such high rates of housing insecurity that for some people lead to actually being in shelters or on the street, essentially because we have so many people who are deeply poor, and we don't have a strong enough social safety net to prevent that from happening. Housing, we have housing is basically a free market economy like the rest of the US economy. Public housing, publicly owned housing forms a very small part of our housing stock. But people at the bottom of our very broad income distribution simply can't afford to pay sufficient rents to keep that housing going, whether it's new or whether it's existing housing. So, essentially we've got all of these people who really can't afford housing, and that leads to first, patterns often first paying rent you possibly can't sustain. Then when you can't do that anymore, moving in with somebody else, and then ultimately ending up on the street.
And Dr. Khadduri, you referenced a couple things. One, that we have a private market for housing, that public housing is a small measure of that, and that we have kind of entrenched economic inequality, and that we also, you also mentioned kind of like federal policies. Like, how would you rank, I guess, like how would you rank kind of the key drivers, or what in your mind is really causing the rise in the housing insecurity?
Well, you referred to the fact that housing assistance is not an entitlement. People with incomes below 50% of the area median income, in theory, are eligible to get a housing voucher or another kind of assisted housing, but only 1 out of 4 such renter households gets that assistance. And so, the housing dimension of the social safety net is broken. We can do something about that if we want to, but we also don't have, income support programs are very much weakened in the US compared to other developed industrial countries. And, particularly income support programs that help families, family homelessness, people with children ending up largely in shelters, but sometimes on the street. I mean, this is almost a unique phenomenon to the United States, and it really has to do with the fact that we don't have a strong support system for people with extremely low incomes and children.
Thank you, Dr. Khadduri. Dr. O'Flaherty, I know you've worked in the context of a large city like Newark and have published a great deal on this topic. I would love to get your perspective, as well as how this impacts the economics of cities.
Okay, so let me start off by a little bit of what has been happening, which is history, and then speculate on some what will be happening, which is the only thing we can affect. So between the end of the Great Recession and the beginning of COVID, for most of the United States, homelessness declined. In fact, the aggregate homelessness is a very significant decline if you leave out Los Angeles and New York. New York and Los Angeles in this pre-COVID period had massive increases in homelessness in totally different ways. Some other rich cities, especially the California cities, had similar stories, but those are the exceptions to the pre-COVID world. And that's part of what your professor, Chris Meyer, has called the superstar cities and the superstar city phenomenon, where during pre-COVID days, there was an increase in demand for locations close to the center of the city by highly skilled, highly paid professionals. And there's an overall increase in many ways. There has been basically a long-term increase in the price of housing, driven by such things as you need to have Wi-Fi in a house now. You need to have better windows because the weather is worse. And the number of adults per household has been going down very, very significantly since the 1970s. Before 1970, it was very, very rare to have a single person household. It's no longer rare. I don't know what happened in COVID. The reliable counts disappeared.
Right.
And so we don't know what happened.
Well,
So,
I think we do know one thing that happened during COVID, and you're quite right that, cities have not been able to do what's called the point in time count because of the public health emergency. I mean, some cities did, but most of them didn't, or they did it on a much reduced basis. But we do have counts of people using shelter. And those counts went down or somewhat for individual people. They went down precipitously for families with children. And I think that really demonstrates that when you strengthen the safety net, you will go far towards alleviating family homelessness. I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot that we don't know about. We don't know what happened with unsheltered homelessness. We think it probably went up during the pandemic as people were afraid to stay in shelters, or the shelter capacity got reduced in order to keep people safe. And just anecdotally, we're seeing a lot more people on the streets in places like Los Angeles, some of the cities in California that you're talking about.
but again, what I wanted to emphasize about COVID is I hope, history now. That we're not going back to the lockdowns. We're not going back, especially to the large amounts of cash that were put in the street, the improvements of the safety net. What we have to look forward to is a changed world because of COVID. And I believe that changed world is going to lead to a large increase in the price of housing. The most direct drivers of that are that people are going to consume more housing. We're already seeing that. There's a large spike in housing prices everywhere as we come out of COVID. If you think of what the lasting effects of COVID are going to be, they are primarily toward increased housing. There are going to be more people spending more time working at home. You cannot work at home more time on your kitchen table always. Working at home takes space. Children are going to need access to internet capabilities because school is going to continue to have times when it is remote. There are not going to be any snow days anymore. Snow days are history. There are so many things that you can do on Zoom that schools will demand it. So what was happening in schools, what was happening in offices, what was happening in warehouses, what was happening in doctors' offices, we're going to continue to have telehealth, is going to continue. What was happening in nursing homes is going to happen in homes now, because I'm not going to a nursing home after this. So that we have a massive increase in demand for housing. Some of it is for structure, which is not necessarily spread out, but a lot of it will require more land. The primary demanders of more land will be people who are in the top half of the income distribution. As land is demanded for greater use by the top half of the income distribution, prices of housing for the bottom half go up.
But why won't the market respond? Why? And I understand that. I understand your point, and you have some empirical evidence behind it. But the breadth of the income distribution is one of the things that drives housing prices. But I see a question in the Q&A about not in my backyard and the overregulation of housing. I mean, why won't the market respond to increased demand for housing among relatively more affluent people, and therefore, and in a way that frees up older housing to become more affordable to people at the bottom of the income distribution?
The market cannot respond to the demand for land because land is fixed.
Land is fixed, but it can be used more intensively.
At a price.
Yeah, let me, maybe I can jump in for a second. Because I think that we're getting at to Tom's original question of what's driving this. So from an economics perspective, I think it boils down to one price does not clear two markets. There is a market for shelter and there's a market for investment. And when one person who wants the piece of land for investment is competing with one person who wants the piece of land for shelter, I can more or less guarantee you that the person who wants it for investment is going to win. And the vast majority, in fact, of the funds, the liquidity that we've issued over the course of COVID have not gone to the people who are needing it for shelter. It's the people who want it for investment. That what we have seen is a fairly unprecedented rise. And it's not only for COVID, it's really over the last 20 or 30 years in valuations. Valuations of every piece of real estate pretty much under the sun. Do you know what, just to make the point, the amount of rent you would have had to charge in order to earn the return on capital on pretty much any investment in any major urban metro in the United States over the last 10 years is approximately zero. Mainly because you would have gotten an entirety of your return off of real estate appreciation. So we can all debate whether that's sustainable or not. Many people think it might not be. And so we are heading towards what will be politely called mean reversion. But on the other hand, we may be in a new paradigm. We may be in a new normal where low interest rates, excessive liquidity, a higher propensity to save, all means that just assets are way more expensive. And so if we're relying on a system that potentially provides, that says you get shelter if you can pay the price for it, there are a lot of people who won't be able to pay the price. So where I come from is housing is a right. It's a fundamental to participate in society. That the lack of housing has much greater economic consequences over the medium term, notably in higher divorce rates, higher crime rates, lower education rates, lower productivity growth rates. So it's well worth a societal investment in carving out a safe space, if you will, for housing, because in the absence of that, what you will get is a flight to capital for those people who actually have the real estate and are looking for a return on it, because that's the only return they can get.
And I agree. I mean, it has become more expensive to provide adequate housing to everybody because of COVID in many dimensions.
I think that's true, of course. I mean, that there are now greater awareness, but I would also argue that, you know, the actual building of housing, I mean, we haven't improved the productivity of our real estate, of our construction industry pretty much ever. So if we look at how we build things today compared to, I don't know, how you make a car or how you run a supermarket, clearly the latter have changed a lot. Whereas in the former, you still see pretty much the same approaches. And every time I say modular to somebody, they just say, you know, you can't get scale, you can't get standardization. And so, yeah, I think that this industry is really ripe for some level of disruption. So I'd hope that there is, you know, an opportunity here, both in terms of the technology of the building, but also the formats. I mean, in some ways, as it's said in the chat, we have outlawed innovation. We have required people to build the same single family home in the same place. So from over 70% of the urban land area of the United States. It's not the case everywhere else, I should note. So that is a way of freezing us literally in place. And with that, yeah, factor costs go up, as they should. I mean, I think we're all in favor of people's incomes rising, which includes the people building the housing.
Ms. Nevin, curious your perspective. I know you've done a lot of work on housing in the public sector, so curious anything to add to the comments that have been made.
Yeah, I think one of most of what I've been thinking about is like, what does this mean for government? Like, if you are either local or national government, like what are the tools in your toolbox given the situation that we're in? And I agree with everything that Brandan and Jonathan are saying. And a lot of what I've seen under discussion has been sort of on the margins. You know, there are things you can do, for example, to try to advantage buyers who are looking to own versus buyers who are looking to invest. And you've seen jurisdictions do things like impose penalties on all cash purchases of homes to try to like get rid of the advantage that you have if you're buying a property as an investment, as opposed to wanting to actually get a mortgage and live in it. And it seems to me like a lot of that is well-intentioned and a potentially smart policy, but the scale of the challenge is so large. And I don't know if I've seen a lot of momentum, at least like with my experience in state and local clients, but across the country, like momentum behind ideas that meet the moment in terms of demand from the policy side. And I'm, I don't know if I am alone in that feeling, but there's it's part of the problem is whoever asked the question in the chat about the zoning, so much of this is being restricted at a local level. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to see how you can wave a magic federal wand in that situation and make things better. But I'm curious if my fellow panelists have thoughts on just like the overall policy environment that we're living in and whether they're seeing, what kind of momentum we're seeing on the policy response. I'm not seeing much, I guess.
I'm not seeing much either these days.
I mean, there are some. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dad.
Yeah, I saw the best policy response was in the 1880s and 1890s with Henry George and the land tax. Henry George almost was elected mayor of New York in 1884 and in 1896. His book, Progress and Poverty, was the second best-selling book in the 19th century in the United States after the Bible. You can't compete with the Bible. And his proposal of a large tax on land to finance most of government and eliminate speculative motives for holding land, and because of the justice that the value of land comes from what other people do, not what you do, I think is very strong. I mean, it's been endorsed by quite a few Nobel Prize winners in economics. And as Jonathan was emphasizing, what we're talking about is a lot of holding of land. We're talking about a time that there are great needs for expenditure to keep people in good housing. And we're just pissing it all away by creating a class of land speculators who land is what nobody can do. And it's a tax without deadweight loss.
Dr. Khadduri, I know you've, first of all, I believe you've been a strong proponent for housing vouchers. And I know now we're shifting from the kind of the drivers into kind of the solution space. If maybe I can just kind of sum up what I've heard so far. I think from Dr. Woetzel, we heard kind of the investor mindset behind housing, which, you know, drives some of the prices up. It's interesting also because so much of American families' net worth is tied in housing. So there's this like intrinsic pull to want it to increase. We talked about kind of the trends in post-COVID and how COVID is impacting housing. And we talked about federal programs. So with that, Dr. Khadduri, I know you've talked a lot about some of the federal programs like housing vouchers. I think Housing First is a program you've written about. Would love to hear your thoughts on specific policies.
You know, basically, virtually everybody who currently experiences homelessness can easily live in a place of their own. I mean, all it takes is giving them the ability to afford it, and giving them the ability to afford it is pretty straightforward. If you give them a housing voucher, which pays the difference between 30% of their income, however low that income is, and a rent at about the middle of the market. That's how the program works. There are 2+ million households using such vouchers. There need to be twice as many as that. It's a budget item, but as we've seen recently, the federal budget can expand when needed to meet a crisis. So I'm not saying that we should immediately put another 2 million or 3 million housing vouchers into the hands of housing authorities, but a couple 100,000 a year will do a lot to alleviate the problem. It will keep a lot of people from falling into homelessness, and it will give communities the ability to get them out of homelessness. Because one thing we know from the Housing First literature, which largely applies to individuals with who have challenges, who have behavioral health challenges, mental health issues often, it's very well demonstrated that if somebody in that situation gets a housing voucher and access to services, they can be stabilized in housing. And for families, basically all most families need is the ability to pay the rent, and they can leave homelessness or not fall into it in the first place.
Dr. Woetzel and Ms. Nevin, yes.
I mean, I have a question, actually. I feel like I'm playing the wrong role as a panelist, but I think my question is, like, I think a lot about vouchers also, and I'm sure, you know, for those on the call who are listening in who have like sort of gotten into the topic of affordable housing and made it all the way to the end of Evicted, you know, obviously that's like one of Matt Desmond's ideas also. I think one of the debates I often end up in with vouchers is, how do you think about the effectiveness of vouchers in a world where you're not increasing supply? You know, what does that mean in terms of whether you're accomplishing the goals that you're describing?
Well, I mean, it's not as though housing supply is completely static. The supply of housing does increase. It does not increase enough. This is a regional, a locational issue. There are many parts of the country that have enough supply of housing that a housing voucher is fairly easily used. There are places like urban California where it is not, because of the constraints on the supply of housing. So what we need is a balanced policy that both removes some of the barriers to producing housing and maybe even subsidizing producing it, but then provides housing vouchers to make it possible for people to afford to pay for what it costs to produce and operate that housing. So I really think that the regulatory issue is a really important one. It differs a lot across the country, but places like urban California have put really severe constraints on the kind of housing that can be built and where it can be built. And that also has to change.
Let me add to that on the noses to door. The world doesn't work matching doorknobs to noses. There was, as in the 1970s, one of the first large-scale social experiments was the one that led to the voucher system that we know of, where in two cities in the Midwest, South Bend and Green Bay, I don't know what those have in common except for football. They had the housing supply demonstration where they flooded the market with what we would now call vouchers. And prices didn't move. A lot of people rented in place. That's the one good RCT we have on this. Otherwise, it's really hard to tell what's going on now. We don't have good evidence. The argument for, I think that the problem is the allocation of housing as much as is the amount of housing, because doorknobs don't match noses. The number of adults per household is very, very elastic. And the type of people living in a house is very elastic. The traditional story about what happens with vouchers is a filtering story. Over time, houses get older and the people living in them get poorer. There's good empirical evidence now to support filtering. What happens with vouchers is that some of the houses who would have gotten worse don't get worse. They maintain where they are. Some of the houses that are a little bit better get attracted to being able to serve poorer people, so that you've got a change in the allocation of housing. Similarly, when we talk about allocation, there's another thing to think about with California. The problem in California is not only NIMBY. The problem is Proposition 13. What is Proposition 13? Proposition 13 says, essentially, you pay no property tax, except your property tax is based on the value of your home when you bought it. And as long as you live in that house, you pay the same property tax. What's going on? It means that the rate at which, okay, so essentially you're getting subsidized if you live in a house for a long time. If you have a house where you're paying $1,000 a year, and if you sell it, the new owner is going to be paying $15,000 a year. That's $15,000 that is a reduction in your wealth because it's anticipated in the price of the house. And that $13,000 a year that you gain by not selling, you can realize every year. So essentially the state of California is paying people not to move. And people's lives change. There's all sorts of good reasons to move, but you're being paid large amounts. And every year those amounts get bigger and bigger and bigger because of the appreciation of house values to live in the wrong places. So you have California you have houses being misallocated big time in California.
I think,
Because of-
Dr. O'Flaherty is bringing up a really good point, and it is, I think Moretti and Shia's paper is kind of to the quantification of all of this, that if we actually allowed people to move and by building housing where they should be moving, that the whole economy of the United States would be, it's a very large number, so 5% higher or something like that, I think was their model.
Yeah, that's the NIMBY, but it's people there are lots of people in California who are living where they should not be. Lots of people in California should get out of California and allow people who can make a good living to live in these places where they need it to make a living, rather than commute 50 miles. I mean, that's what should happen. I mean, this is a problem with rent control as well, but rent control is not the size of Proposition 13.
So what is what's the political will for getting, I mean, California is a fairly progressive state, and there's been a lot of recent appropriations that have to do with affordable housing and directly with homelessness. But is there any political will for getting rid of Prop 13?
As a Californian, so
I mean, nothing is politically feasible until it happens.
I think that was the when there's a saying about, that our objective here is to make the unthinkable there's in a moment of the Overton window shifting, or when the impossible becomes thinkable, that so we're working towards that, and up until that moment it doesn't happen, but I think we're getting there. I really think we're getting there as far as California goes, and it's for all the reasons that were said. And first of all, I mean, I think the unhoused population or people experiencing homelessness is just the tip of the iceberg, as was said. That in LA we've got 60, 70,000 people on the street. We got another 20 or 30,000 in their cars, but we've got, like, in the city of LA, easily 2 or 3 million who are who are paying more than 30 to 40% of their income in housing, which is a straight tax, and it's a very unproductive tax. It's a tax on their economic activity, and it's a tax as a straight wealth transfer. So I mean, that's a big drag, and at some point people start to basically push back on that. And I think the problem has been a political problem. How do you mobilize people who are effectively, disenfranchised, that they're not attending zoning board meetings, that they don't have any time in their day, they're not voting, so that, and along with this, they're vulnerable populations. These are, of course, a large chunk of undocumented and people who are simply unable to participate for whatever reason. So I think that there is clearly a political problem, but as has been said, Dr. O'Flaherty we're +1 for being a Georgist. There are solutions to this. We can make the market work if we chose to do so. And clearly that we have, and I don't think California is a progressive state. So California is a very conservative state when it comes to things like actually providing for people. And for that matter, what I think California does indicate is that they are maybe 5 or 10 years ahead of the rest of the country, because trust me, it'll get there. I have a good friend of mine, Manuel Pastor, who says the rest of the country is experiencing its Prop 187 moment. To throw another proposition on the table, Prop 187 was passed by Governor Wilson, and in the very short version of this, the landowners of California woke up in the morning and realized that the next generation of Californians was going to be Black, brown, and Asian, and lower income. and they were not happy about funding that. So they defunded it. They cut the benefits. They said you will no longer be, undocumented will no longer be eligible to apply. Prop 13 was passed at the same time. We're not going to fund it. And by the way, we're going to incarcerate everybody. So incarceration rates went up by 3 or 4 times in California. This all happened back in the 90s, 80s actually, in 90s. So then we, 20 years later, have come out at the other end of that, realizing that's a failed policy. And are starting to move in the other direction, but it's a long, slow pendulum. And he would argue that this is a context that is now first evident in California and will be evident elsewhere. And that we're going to see a societal shift away from these kind of let's ignore the problem and hope it goes away, which is essentially that Prop 187 thing, to one where we're saying we're going to have to incorporate this externality. And I'll just conclude with one very tactical thing. LIHTC is a very bad substitute. So LIHTC being the federal government's program to subsidize affordable housing. So how you build affordable housing is by getting a tax credit essentially against that. The process. I'll let Jennie speak to that maybe if she wants to talk about it. But it is far and wide known in the world of development as one's least favorite process, one which is highly political. And which, simply, you can, whatever you say about it, it's not, you shouldn't expect on it to solve the problem. I mean, it does what it does. It produces the amount of units that it produces every year. It's not going to produce any more units than that. And so we will need a new mechanism to get there.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a minor point to add on to that, but I think there's also on the piece on structurally what's going wrong, or like what are some of the challenges are on the political side. I heard an interesting argument recently that I thought was really compelling, especially given that I've sat through a lot of zoning hearings, which is that the individuals who own housing or that already benefit from status quo show up, like they know who they are and they know what they have to lose. And it's the individuals who could benefit from like the new building who don't know who they are. If they don't know, there's many people who benefit from it, but they don't actually have like, you can have this apartment if you show up to this meeting, like that doesn't exist in development. You don't develop a building and give it all the units and then say, hey, go show up to these like local zoning hearings. And as long as you know who you are when you're losing something and you don't know who you are when you're gaining something, you just have a natural mismatch between who's actually showing up fighting.
So why don't we go to the old Chinese system and sell the apartments before we build the building?
Yeah, I think a lot of places, I mean, this is one of the shortcomings of LIHTC is that it doesn't do that. So, I think developers could be very well incentivized to build for affordable if you allow these by right, essentially. So you essentially have to jump over the local. So I like the words by right because, or ministerial as it's sometimes framed. They're saying like by right, this thing being what it is, as in affordable or lower income, we are going to create a safe space for it, and that will not be substitute, not be subject to discretionary review, which generally translates into don't build it. And I think that's a societal consensus issue. So are we going to get a consensus that we need to have this type of housing built? And if so, I think there will be, because it's if you take it at the federal level, there's going to be a question like where. Okay, so then we get into this conversation about population, or is it by economy, or so what's the model for this? We had the opportunity zones are an example of that. Basically a map drawn by congressional staffers pretty much overnight and not particularly correlated to anything. So asking Washington DC to draw the map may not be the best answer here either. But there's got to be a better answer.
Well, among the many things that are wrong with LIHTC, which is the low-income housing tax credit program that's been around since the late 80s, is that it's allocated on a per capita basis to states, which means that it goes to places that really don't need to expand the supply of affordable housing, and not enough of it goes to places that that need it the most. Now, you could argue that California has brought the problem on itself, and therefore should not get an outsized allocation of LIHTC. But my solution to that would be to require to require a match. I mean, I think any expansion of that program, and it's such a politically popular program that I don't see it going away. But I think any expansion of the program should require the state that takes the program to come up with matching funds.
Jonathan's suggestion of by right, I think that is a good idea, but I think that the rights should not be vested in developers. I think the rights should be given to poor people. And then developers would have to gather the poor people and convince the poor people that what they're doing is good. And then those rights to build in various towns could be exercised. It's just an extension of vouchers, really. It's vouchers with power.
Wow, it's a lot to digest there. I did want to touch on one thing, and then maybe we can switch to questions.
I did realize also, just like Tom, I'm noticing this is like advanced housing. Like I realized we went through like 15 minutes on LIHTC without spelling it. And so whoever I put in that question of like, I'm impressed that you figured out what we were saying.
Right, the acronym is correct too. Yeah. I mean, I think it's great that this will be recorded, right? Because a lot of stuff to dig in and follow up on. And maybe with the Bernstein Center, what we can do is kind of collect some links to share. I know a lot of the panelists have written great books on the subject, so would love to share those with the attendees as well. One last thing I wanted to touch on. So, Jonathan, you mentioned the history of discrimination in housing markets, and there's a great book by I think Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, talks about the history of that, but it still happens, right? And I think there's been research from Brookings recently that shows that Black property owners have their housing assessed at a steep discount. But discrimination also applies in the voucher system, right? I mean, there's a big problem of discrimination against voucher holders. So I would love to hear thoughts on that.
Yeah, some states and some cities have what's called source of income laws, and that means that you can't refuse to rent your apartment or your house to somebody just because they are using a voucher to pay part of the rent. And there's good evidence that those source of income laws are effective, that they make it easier to rent housing, and there's even some sort of inferential evidence that overall they reduce the amount of racial discrimination. Those source of income laws are potentially very powerful, but they require enforcement. There is such a law on the books for California, but I don't think that the kind of support for litigation by the private bar has taken place yet and made that source of income law in California as effective as it could be.
Great. Jennie, you're breaking up.
Levers there too on source of income discrimination is the potential for analytics to play a role there. Violations. Did I lose you guys? I went off video because looks like I lost you. Uh-oh.
No, you're still there, Jennie, but you did break up.
Got it. Yeah, I was just saying, on source of income discrimination, there's the other part of that is also the enforcement that happens, like in catching it. And I've seen some interesting examples of analytics playing a role there, being able to basically anticipate where there should be more, people who are paying for apartments with their voucher, and where there's like a mismatch between what should be or what is expected to be there and what is there is actually a way you can help target where you're going to send the folks who check for things like source of income discrimination or fair housing violations. And obviously that's been a really difficult process to scale when it's literally just testers who go out and do it. So I've been kind of excited about the potential for data to help make that be more effective, in addition to what you're saying.
Oh, I see Jonathan is typing some answers.
Yeah, trying to be helpful in the chat. Yeah, we did just jump into advanced housing. I do want to sort of not be overly despairing, because I think that the wheels of democracy grind slowly, but they do grind. Right now we're at a very interesting moment in California with what we call, through another acronym at you, RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Program, which is the way the state is finally, cracking down on NIMBY, as been mentioned, and basically the landholders by saying, we're not going to fund you if you don't comply with your regional housing needs assessment. And that means that, and that regional housing needs assessment is something that's done every, I think 8 years. And had some very bizarre things in the past. Basically, like the city of Beverly Hills, its needs assessment for the growth of Beverly Hills was 2 units. That's all they needed. So it was not very hard to comply with the regional housing needs assessment. This year, this cycle's regional housing needs assessment, that 2 is turned into, I don't know, like 2,000, 3,000. So now you have protests in Beverly Hills about how can you possibly expect us to build all this housing? And then you come up with fake plans, like fake news. You have fake plans. And then it bounces up to the state, and the state says, that's a fake plan. You have to go back and redo it. You can't, your assumptions are ludicrous. And so now we have this back, and then Beverly Hills sues the state. I'm making Beverly Hills up. Incidentally, I don't know if they have, other cities have. So apologies to the mayor of Beverly Hills if that's not the case. But this debate is ongoing right now. And I sort of view, RHNA as this very slow moving steamroller, and it's like kind of gradually crushing things as it moves across the landscape. And you worry about the engine. Does the engine have enough, gas in the tank or whatever, charge in the battery to keep going? I don't know, because you're going to need a lot of lawyers on this one. It's going to be interesting. This is apparently how we solve our problems. We sue people.
I'm not sure I can give you good news, since New Jersey has had something similar since 1976.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Massachusetts has this Chapter 40B. I'm in Boston, and the 40B housing, or the 40B rules in Massachusetts, essentially allow developers to override local zoning laws to increase affordable housing if a certain city doesn't have enough affordable housing. So essentially, it's like there are certain cities where it's deemed too unaffordable, and it just takes away their right to have local zoning bylaws when there's an affordable housing project. It's like by right, but like kind of targeted. And it has been, as a resident, I hear a lot of success stories.
The East Coast is a little bit ahead of California on this one. It seems to us, but maybe California will do something different than the East Coast has done.
So we're coming up on time. I just wanted to recap a couple things. So we talked about some of the drivers of the rise in both homelessness, but also in housing insecurity. A lot of different ideas were proposed and put forward that are all have their own sources and of insight. So Dr. O'Flaherty, you mentioned Henry George, which is dating back, right, and before the 1900s, and I did read that. It was an interesting read. I remember. So there's a land tax. We talk about the expanding the voucher program as an entitlement, given that it's currently not, and it doesn't serve the actual population that needs it. We talked about supply options of local zoning, overrides, and other methods to increase supply of housing. A lot of great ideas that I think we can follow up. I did want to say one thing, Dr. Khadduri, I read your book, Homelessness in the Midst of Plenty. A statistic that just blew my mind was, I think I'm quoting it correctly, you say that the most common age of someone to be in a homeless shelter is infancy.
Right.
Right. That is unbelievable. And I tell that that really stuck with me. Whenever I talk to people about this issue, I mention that, and everyone is surprised when I ask them, what do you think the most common age of homelessness is? But that is true. This is something that impacts children, it impacts families. It is a crisis. And so I am also, like Dr. Woetzel, I'm hopeful. There are lots of great ideas, a lot of evidence behind these things, and I'm hopeful that we can make some changes there. The last thing I'll ask, this is a business school event. Any advice for the students, especially those who are going into real estate industry, who might be concerned about housing, in cities, and any kind of words of advice from anyone?
Oh boy. Jonathan, your thoughts?
Oh, yeah, well, sorry, I'm too busy. with
Jonathan's
chat.
busy, right, answering all the chat questions, which is
No, I'm just trying to be helpful. But look, no,
Carry on,
I
Jonathan.
first of all think this is a crucial issue for our time. First, so real estate, 20% of the economy, give or take. So big enough, you should be involved. And secondly, yeah, the source of most wealth in a society, 70% of the global balance sheet is in real estate. All this talk about, intangibles and, and sort of cool stuff in manufacturing, nah, real estate. So so if you are interested in money, you are interested in housing and real estate. And if you are interested in society, you are interested in housing and real estate, because without a home, you're not going to be a participant in society. So all of this is to say, this is a great place to be. It is public-private in nature. You got to keep an open mind. You got to listen to all the perspectives if you want to make progress on this. But then, be all in. I feel like this is for the United States, this is the fight of our lives, quite literally. If we do not make homes for the people of the United States, we will not have a United States. This will not be sustainable. So I encourage you to try.
Yeah, I would just pile on and say that I think we need more people who do housing and other things. Like what we joked about advanced housing, and like I think a lot of, me personally, I spent a lot of time thinking about housing. I'm not deep on healthcare. I'm not as deep as in other policy issues. And increasingly, I think that makes no sense. Like people who care about education need to understand housing policy. People who care about energy need to understand housing, climate change. People who care about healthcare need to care about housing policy, and we need to be fluent in each other's languages. Like I talk to healthcare people who are sick and tired of seeing sick people come into the hospital because of things that have to do with housing, and they don't understand the housing language. They don't understand how to go to a legislator and talk about increasing LIHTC allocations. They know Medicaid, and they know how to potentially use waivers to pay for permanent supportive housing. It's like having conversations with healthcare people is two people who are super deep on policy who know nothing about each other's worlds, and it makes it harder for us to cross subsidize the different policy goals we have to accomplish like housing goals. Like we should be able to leverage healthcare funding and energy funding and whatever to like actually help housing goals, but we all end up in our little rooms by ourselves and don't know about each other's worlds. So for those of you who are not necessarily housing people, make this part of your world.
Closing thoughts, Dr. O'Flaherty and Dr. Khadduri?
Well, I'd like to echo what Jennie said, and I think that there's a lot of conversation now, a lot of recognition that housing is a social determinant of health. So I think those conversations across those sectors are now beginning to happen, both nationally and on the local level.
Yes, I would say, finally, watch things to change. Don't believe that what you see now is going to last very long. Housing is going to change a lot in the next several decades. Because of changes in COVID, because it's not sustainable now, because housing while the production of housing hasn't changed in the last several decades, the uses of housing have tremendously. And we're going to see more and more of that. this is a time, I think, as Jonathan, it's a time of disruption in housing. And it's a time to keep an open mind and not try to repeat what people have told you about how things worked in the last 50 years.
Those words. Thank you to my esteemed panelists. Thank you to all the attendees. Great conversation. Thank you all.